and the shoulder joint, and then we'll have a lab break. And then I'll come back into ulnar radius in hand, and then we'll finish up with lab as well. So we're going to have a lecture lab time. Okay? In addition, there's an open lab this afternoon. And I was wrong, the open lab wasn't last Friday. As some of us found out, it's this coming Friday, which is fine because we have our test on Tuesday. Okay? All right, so starting out with the upper extremity, the bones that attach the upper extremity to the axial skeleton form what is known as the pectoral girdle. Right? There are two bones involved. The clavicle is the one that actually does the articulation with the axial skeleton. So the only joint by which the upper extremity is attached to the axial skeleton is right here, between the clavicle and the manubrium. The sternum is attached by muscles, all right, but there is no joint surface between the sternum and the ribs, or the sternum and the vertebra. So the only thing that attaches all of this, the ligaments, to this portion of the body is about a surface here the size of a thumbprint. Right? And that's where the sternum rests on the clavicle. And then the other bone of the pectoral girdle is the scapula. So find the bone that looks like this in your box. That's the clavicle. It's got a double S shape, about 5.5 inches long, so maybe a little shorter. Question? And when you break the clavicle, then it just kind of the whole thing just kind of droops down. Now, if you look at the clavicle, the first thing I want you to be able to do is identify the superior and inferior surface. The superior surface is relatively smooth compared to the inferior surface. So this is a superior view. The inferior surface has a couple of bumps and rough areas. All right, so the next diagram is actually a drawing, but it might make it a little bit clearer on how rough and bumpy, because we have muscles that attach the clavicle to the first rib, and anytime we have a muscle attachment, that makes it more coarse. All right, so by looking at the clavicle, find the superior and inferior surface. The inferior is going to face towards the floor. Now find the end that attaches to the clavicle. It's blunted, as if you took a rolled piece of clay and push it against your hand this way, so it's flattened this way, okay? So if you were to push it against a vertical, that's going to articulate with the sternum. So we looked at the manubrium on Friday, and the clavicle is going to articulate just by resting on that surface, okay? And so that end of the clavicle is identified as the sternal end, or the sternal extremity. The other end is flattened as if you stepped on it with your heel. So you took that same piece of clay and kind of pinched it between your thumb and fingers, or stepped on it. So instead of being this way, it's as if you squished it this way. Okay? And that articulates with a process of the scapula known as the acromion. So that end is the acromial end, or extremity. Not the acromion, because that's a process of the scapula. Okay, so how do you figure out if the clavicle that is in your box is a left or a right clavicle? Well, the first thing you have to do is find that rough surface and place it facing downward. And then you want to place the sternal end on your clavicle. Now, you can turn it either way, but if it's in the correct position, the two clavicles will curve forward and then back to the scapula. So it makes like a collar on a shirt or a blouse. Okay? So it's going to curve forward and then back. So if I move this guy, I don't know how far I can tilt him, but you can see how this curves forward like a small collar and then back to the scapula. So again, I could have flipped, I could take this clavicle. Someone have a clavicle I can use? Thank you. So here's the flattened end, here's the acromial end, and this would be a right clavicle. See how it curves downward? Now I can take it like this and still have the superior smooth and have this be the sternal end, but it's not a left one. See how it curves away? It curves towards my back rather than down. So it has to curve down like it's forming a set of collars, and it fits like that.
I don't see what you're talking about.
So in other words, this is sternal. So I could have it sternal like that, or I could have it sternal like this.
Okay.
If I have it sternal like that, it's curving back away instead of forward. So look at, see how it's that way, whereas if I do it this way, that curve is coming forward like a collar, like I drew on the board. So let's use yours. So this would be your rough surface. Okay, that's the sternal end. So if I could have it like this, or without turning it upside down, I can switch it around and have it like this. So I still have to figure out which is left or right. I know that that goes down, and this goes to my sternum. But I can still do that and have it on this side. So this curve needs to come forward, anterior, rather than curve backward. Okay? So this would be a left clavicle. Okay? So the right and left clavicles together, this curve for left and right should create a collar-like structure, hence collarbone, on your surface. Okay? So the acromial end versus the sternal end, smooth versus rough. And it doesn't form a very stable appearing joint. It just rests on top of the manubrium, and it just barely touches the acromion. And then we use a lot of ligaments to hold it in place. But you can't see nice, clear-cut, smooth joint surfaces like we normally do. Okay? But the sternal end and the acromial end are both joint surfaces. That would be a left.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now the clavicle is one of the last bones, not the last, because the xiphoid process is still cartilaginous. This is formed by endochondral ossification. And it stays cartilage until you're around 3 or 4. When my oldest son was little, we lived in a different house. It was 1.5 stories. My husband bought it because the staircase was about 8 feet wide. And it was carpeted all the way down to the carpet of the living room. I thought it was a waste of space, but it did help. You could handle 20 people sitting on that if you had a party. He bought it when we were engaged, so it was his money that bought it. I didn't have any say over the house. But the kids loved to slide down those stairs. They'd get rug burns, but they didn't care. And when my oldest son was just barely a year old, he got knocked down the stairs by my husband, not on purpose. My husband was going back and forth between our bedroom and the office, and our bedroom door was only about that, the space was about that far from the edge of the door to the stairs. And he was standing in the doorway, and Chris was behind him, and unknowingly he stepped back, and that knocked Chris down the stairs. And he just did a log roll all the way down the carpeted stairs, and the bottom was carpeted. So, of course, we went tearing after him, and he was fine. About a year later, I had a friend whose daughters were about 5 years older, and they were trying to teach him how to climb the stairs, and he already knew. And all the confusion and tussle, he went falling down the stairs again. Still fine. When he was 3, he came out of our bathtub and went scooting around the doorway, lost his feet were wet, and they slipped out from under him, and again, he rolled down the stairs. Another log roll. Well, we're getting used to it by this time, so we didn't go after him quite as fast. But when I went to put him in his car seat, I would always pick him up by pinning his arms to his side and then just pick him up as one piece, and he whimpered. And 2 or 3 days later, his babysitter said, you know, when Chris was sitting on the floor, and he fell over on his shoulder, and he started to cry. I was like, he shouldn't be crying over that shoulder injury this long after he went down the stairs. So I took him to the pediatrician. She took x-rays and said, yep, he broke his collarbone. And I could actually feel a little bump from the callus where it was healing. So I felt really guilty. And I said, well, you know, would you have done anything to it if I'd brought him in earlier? And she said, no, we don't really cast broken collarbones. And I said, well, he goes to preschool in the morning and he climbs around. Should I have him not climb on the monkey bars? And she said, no, that's fine, just don't throw him down the stairs again. Well, Christopher heard that. And sitting on the top of the stairs was where I pulled his socks on and his pants and everything. And so for the next 10 months, when I went to dress him, he would scream, don't throw me down the stairs, Mom. So I always looked out and made sure the neighbors weren't around when I did that. But the difference between those 3 occasions was the first 2 occasions, it was still a cartilage model. And it had a little bit more give to it. Okay? The 3rd time, it was bone. And that's how the collarbone off the clavicle gets broken, is people fall on their shoulders. My mom broke her collarbone. When I finished graduate school at Davis, I was returning to my teaching job in Tennessee, and she decided to help me drive across the country because she had a friend when she was in college who was killed in an accident doing that, so she was nervous. I said, fine. I had a really bad cold. She said, take your cold medicine and I'll drive while you sleep it off. Big mistake. Middle of the day at noon, an hour east of Albuquerque, she fell asleep. And I woke up because of the rough shoulder. You know, it's still paved but rough. And I said, Mom, what are you doing? And that woke her up. So we were on cruise control. I put it on cruise control before when she started driving, 63 miles an hour. And she grabbed the wheel and she went like this. And we went shooting across all the lanes of traffic going east. And then she went the other direction. And fortunately, there were no big rigs because they travel about 85 miles an hour through New Mexico. And on the right side were 500-foot cliffs. Because we were in the mountains. And they weren't everywhere. After doing this for a while, she just let go. We're still at 63 miles an hour. And we went down a small bank, about 20 feet, and there was a grove of small pine trees that she decided she didn't want to hit at 63 miles an hour. So she turned the wheel. So we're going down like this and then turned up, and the centrifugal force just flipped us 2.5 times, and we landed on the roof. So we were perfectly fine because she never wore a seatbelt before that. I wouldn't let her start the car until she had her seatbelt on, or she would have been thrown from the car. So the only damage to us, the car was totaled, and I just made my last payment. The car was totaled, and she broke her left collarbone because of when we first flipped, it broke the rear axle on the car coming down so hard, and she hit her window, and that broke her collarbone. I hit my leather briefcase that was between our 2 seats, and I was fine. Actually, on a side note, about a year later, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she started giving away all her stuff, told my dad who was supposed to remarry. And my younger sister was at Loma Linda in Southern California and knew a breast cancer specialist and said, come out here and get it checked out. So the guy did a biopsy and was telling her at the time, yeah, 95% chance it's breast cancer. It was a lipid necrosis. An area of dead fat cells from that same accident. So that was 1987. She doesn't have breast cancer. But it's that position between the sternum and the humerus that gives it that fragile position. So any lateral blow tends to break the clavicle. Okay? Yes?
So the way it heals, why it kind of sticks out more?
Well, it can heal with a bump.
Because I broke mine.
Yeah, and that's usually that callus gets absorbed, but we don't have a lot of muscles to straighten that out. The really only muscle that attaches to the clavicle is from above and below, so there's nothing that equalizes the force from behind and below. All right, so clavicle, figuring out left and right. And again, for each of these bones that you need to identify left and right, in your lecture notes is a small box that tells you the steps to go through to figure out whether it's a left or right. So the next bone of the pectoral girdle is the scapula. And the layman's term for scapula is the shoulder blade. Okay. So while this is attached to the posterior ribs by muscles, it only forms a joint with the humerus and the clavicle. And it has 2 surfaces, an anterior and a posterior surface. So let's look at that. Here's the scapula. Would this be a right scapula or a left scapula?
Left.
Okay, it goes like this. So the spine is on the posterior aspect, and all of these processes are lateral. This is what's going to articulate with my humerus. So if I make it a right, I'm going to have my humerus coming out the middle of my back. Okay? So one of the things you need to remember when you're determining left or right is that it's the left or right of the person it belongs to. So like if I look at you, Sandy, your left arm is on my right side, it's still your left arm, even though it's on my right side. Okay, so you have to think about the person that this bone belongs to. This would be a left scapula. The one on the picture is a right. Okay, so now we have anterior and posterior surfaces. This is the posterior surface. This is just under the skin. You can see the spine. So if you're feeling your back, you can feel that bony process just under the skin coming out this direction. And the surface facing the ribs is the anterior surface, and that's smooth. All right, because there's muscle there, but it's still a smooth surface. So let's diagram. I'll copy the diagram on the board. So the scapula is shaped like a triangle. The medial border is straight, and that's what is closest to the vertebra. All right, so if you look at this, the medial border is straight, and the lateral border angles outward. There are only two joint surfaces, so everything else is going to be a site of muscle attachment. Okay? So I will identify the joint surfaces, and everything else I'm naming muscles attached to. So medial border, lateral border, arising from the medial border and moving laterally is a narrow ridge known as the spine, and it expands to form the acromions or acromial process, and this is a joint surface. It doesn't look like the facets and joint surfaces we're used to, but this is where the clavicle is going to articulate. So this forms a joint with the acromial end of the clavicle. Okay, so that would be this process right here. Also on the lateral area, we have the glenoid fossa or glenoid cavity. This is another joint surface with the humerus. So the acromion and the glenoid fossa are going to be lateral surfaces. The acromion is also a posterior process. All right, you can see it here. The spine is posterior. On the back side, the acromion is posterior. All right, the glenoid fossa is lateral. Superior border. All right, this surface is for muscle attachment. So if you look at the scapula, below the spine is a broad surface. Now this whole structure is body, but I never ask for the body. I asked for the processes of the body. So this surface below the spine is identified as the infraspinous fossa. And when we do muscles, we have a muscle that has its attachment there, and it's called the infraspinatus muscle. Above the spine, we have the supraspinous fossa. Okay. This is a suprascapular notch for nerves by the same name, suprascapular nerves. And this is always a notch. And then here you can barely see, hidden because it's an anterior process, is another muscle attachment known as the coracoid process. So I'm going to draw it. I'll show it to you on the diagram. Notice it's a C. So the one-letter rule, forgiveness, doesn't work here. Coronoid process we talked about on the mandible. This is coracoid. Okay? It's actually C-O-R-O-N for coronoid, C-O-R-A-C, coracoid. It means bird's beak. So it's this process right here. So it's an anterior process, and it's for muscle attachment. So if we turn this around, it's this bump right here, sticking out. Looks like the acromion, but it's on the front. So if you follow your spine, you can feel the acromion right here. Okay? And the coracoid is down here. So that is a muscle process, muscles attached to that move your scapula forward or move your humerus forward. It's a site of muscle attachment. Okay? So again, this is a posterior view of the scapula. So lecture type questions would be the acromion process is a lateral, anterior, posterior, medial, what? Is it lateral or medial? Lateral. Is it anterior or posterior? Posterior. Okay? So those short answer questions, I might say identify a posterior process of the scapula. Name one. Any of those. Spine, acromion, supraspinous fossa, infraspinous fossa, those are all posterior processes. Okay? Now if we look at the anterior view, again we would have the glenoid fossa. This would be all smooth, and then we would have the coracoid process here with the acromion behind it. So this would be acromion, and this would be coracoid. And this entire smooth surface is subscapular fossa. So we have supraspinous and infraspinous, and then subscapular. All right? This view, while it's confusing at first, helps you to understand what I mean by anterior and posterior. So at a lateral view, we're seeing the glenoid fossa or cavity. Here's the spine. So all of this is posterior. Here's the spine. Here's the acromion, which is posterior. Here's the supraspinous fossa and infraspinous fossa. Here's the coracoid process, which is anterior, and the subscapular fossa, which is anterior. Okay. You don't need to worry about supraglenoid or infraglenoid tubercle.
What was the other one? Infraglenoid?
Infraglenoid tubercle, you don't have to worry. Those are bumps at the top and bottom of the glenoid fossa.
The coracoid is
Muscle. It's anterior.
anterior process.
We have two anterior, coracoid and subscapular, three lateral, coracoid, acromion, and glenoid, and then all of these are posterior. The only medial process we have is the angles and the medial border, but no bumps. Now let's take a look at the